welcome back, everybody, for the fourth official episode of Sleeping with Steve, the podcast that is designed to help you fall asleep and stay asleep faster. Presented by the soothing tones of me, Steve, as I tell you about some of the more forgotten moments in history, some of the occurrences that you maybe not, maybe you didn't know about, or maybe you did, and you just want a little bit more insight. Even if you don't care much for history, this podcast is designed to help you relax and, just think of it as a conversation between me and you don't, it's a one-sided conversation, so just sit back and relax, and you'll find out some cool history tonight. So today we're going to be talking about the Russo-Japanese War, which was a war in the early 1900s that really set the stage for geopolitical events down the road, major implications on world politics, as well as kind of setting the stage for some of the more major events in history, including both of the world wars. Now let me not spoil it too much and remain with the integrity of the show, as I like to do, full of integrity. So I would just like to say that, I'll give you a little bit of a rundown. So we have the intro, which depending on who you ask, I could still be in the intro, or maybe I moved on to the second part here, which is the structure, a little bit of a housekeeping portion of the show. So let me just tell you a little bit how this is going to go down. So, like I said earlier, this podcast is a podcast that is designed to help you fall asleep or relax. That's the main goal here. That's why I'm speaking in this tone of voice right now. I would just like to remind everybody about how the show works, and I'll take this time right now to do so. So, first we have the intro, in which I tell you, hey guys, welcome back to the show. This is the fourth episode, and we're going to be speaking about the Russo-Japanese War. And that's just kind of to give you a bit of a taste of what kind of what you're going to be getting yourself into tonight or today. I'm not sure what time you'll be indulging in this show, but here we are, and excuse me. So now we're going. Let me walk you through the structure. So we have the intro, and now the structure of the show. After the intro, we're gonna have a period of time where Steve, will be kind of, setting the tone, really letting you guys settle in and find your spot to get comfortable, or maybe you're doing the dishes right now, maybe you're brushing your teeth, getting ready for bed. So this portion is going to be, this time slot will be here to let you prepare yourself for the actual story, which comes after this portion. And also a little, so it goes intro and then setting the stage. Wow, somebody's stomping upstairs right now. Very nice. So we'll have the intro and then this part where I start to, let you guys unwind and find your spot where you will feel most comfortable to listen. And then after that, I'll get into the actual story, the events tonight. So, I'm assuming nobody really knows much about this war. I only knew a very small bit about it prior to researching for this show. And, if you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. I'd be willing to bet that probably 90% of Americans do not know anything about what this conflict was and how it set up so many other, it set up a domino effect, a Rube Goldberg, if you will, of major geopolitical events in the fallout. It was a very, very important event that I think deserves to have more light shed on it. But while we're here, I think I may as well tell you, like I have in the previous episodes, why I do this show. And the reason why is, I typically, I myself have trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. Often it takes me about an hour to really start counting those sheep. Whenever I'm in bed, I do a lot of tossing. I do some turning. But, it's kind of hard out there. And no matter what I do, I need some sort of noise in the background. Whether it's a white noise machine, whether it's throw on a YouTube video or some music, or leave the TV on. But I know most of you guys are probably at home with your parents right now, so maybe leaving the TV on isn't the best option. You might run up the electrical bill and get yourself kicked out. A ticket to the street, if you will, from mom and dad. So I like doing this podcast because I think you guys might benefit from me speaking into this microphone and in this soothing tone, and maybe it'll help you fall asleep faster. Another major point that I really, another pillar of this show is that a reason why I do it is because I really enjoy history, and I feel that history is oftentimes a topic that a lot of people overlook for whatever reason. I think there's a lot to be gained from looking back in the past. And I think, we can learn a lot of lessons about ourselves, not only as individuals, but as a society, as we take a look back and, apply some of the lessons learned in these events to current day. Another reason building off of that is that, I kind of put the two first reasons together and say that I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that a lot of people think that history is boring. And, history is not boring. I'm boring. for all intents and purposes for right now. So I think a lot of people typically, if you're going to fall asleep in class, if you look back at your middle school, high school, college days, a lot of the classes that you would be dozing off in or find yourself looking at your Instagram in class would be a history course. Not that the topic isn't interesting, it's just I've always noticed that a lot of people tend to have a certain feeling about a history class. And, if you think of somebody reading an encyclopedia of the history of the world, it may be very interesting, but it's oftentimes very hard to keep up with it. I remember, let me just preface this with, if you're new to the show, you'll notice that I oftentimes go on tangents, and I speak about things that seemingly may not relate to the overall story or the show at all. And that's just kind of to reinforce the idea that this is a conversation more so than a history lesson. I will try my best to have you guys leave this show being more informed on some of the events that have occurred, and I hope you take the knowledge with you afterwards. And who knows, maybe you can be like me and pretend to be smarter than you are by listening to bits and pieces here and there and applying those into your everyday conversation. I guarantee you, if you speak about the Russo-Japanese War to somebody, maybe even, let's say your high school teacher, you may come out of this knowing more about this important event than they do. And they spent years in school studying for historical events, so maybe that'll give you some brownie points. And if you maybe get some extra points out of that, that's always nice. So this portion of the podcast is probably going to go, I should have said this earlier, it's probably going to go on for probably until the 15 to 20 minute mark, where I continue this banter with you to allow you to prepare for bed, or maybe you're de-stressing and on your way home from work and you've hit some rough traffic. Now, if that's the case, I genuinely hope you don't fall asleep. So I will be, disclaimer, don't fall asleep while you're driving and listening to the Sleeping with Steve podcast. I'm not responsible, because history is interesting. That being said, if you're not in the car operating heavy machinery at the current moment, I fully encourage you guys to make a nest somewhere, cuddle up. Blue 42, everybody cuddle up, everybody. So I just, thanks for being here. And it's truly a pleasure being able to do this for you guys. And I hope you get knowledge out of this. And if not, I hope you guys get, at the very least, a good 45 minutes to an hour worth of relaxing time, and maybe you fall asleep. If this one episode doesn't do it for you, and you need some more time to, get get situated and actually fall asleep, then, you could press autoplay if you're listening on YouTube. It's also available on SoundCloud. That's a shameless plug. But believe me, there's a lot of shame. So, yeah, I mean, if this one doesn't put you out, then, probably listen to the other 3 episodes before this. I'm actually recording a double header tonight. So that would give you 5 shows. So that's about 5 hours of me talking at you, encouraging you to count those sheep and, learn a little bit more. Maybe you surprise some of your friends or family members with some of this knowledge. They say, "Oh, ooh, you know what I just thought about actually? You could use this show. I don't condone this, but if you wanted to, if you're kind of slacking in a history class and your mom comes up to you and she says, Steve, your grades are slipping in history. It looks like you haven't been going to class. You have to tell me something about it." And you could always reply, well, Mom, in fact, last Tuesday we learned about the Russo-Japanese War and why it was a major military conflict between Eastern and Western powers. It set the stage for a massive geopolitical upswing. And, I guarantee you that'll put an end to that. Sorry, moms. But, it's a bit of a cheat code for you guys, if you will. So, yeah, just a couple more minutes of this housekeeping right now. I hope you guys are doing well. And, yeah, I'm not sure how this quarantine is affecting everybody. But, for me, I've been having very, very, strange and very vivid dreams recently. And oftentimes it puts me at ease, stressful thoughts about what's going on in the world today, or do I have enough points to pass this course, or, just the general stress of life. And, I hope that this show can give you a little bit of solitude in E minor and give you a real chance to relax. Learning and relaxation are 2 of my favorite things, and I hope those are 2 things that I can provide for you with the show. Alright, so let's actually get into this, shall we? So the Russo-Japanese War was a conflict that was fought between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan. It was a very, very short war. It started in 1904 and ended in 1905, so it was short-lived, but don't let that fool you. It was very important. People often call this World War Zer0. And not because, don't confuse with World War Z, which is a book by, I believe, Max Brooks, the son of Mel Brooks, legendary comedian and actor. but also the movie adaptation starring Brad Pitt. It's about zombies. I recommend the book. The movie's okay. Yeah, I might be hard pressed to say that. Well, not hard pressed. That might be Brad Pitt's worst movie. Sorry, Mr. Pitt, but you have a very impressive catalog, and no disrespect intended. So back to the Russo-Japanese War. So a lot of this fighting took place in what is now northeast China. And most of this war actually consisted of naval battles. So these conflicts typically occurred near the Korean Peninsula, modern-day Korea. And, basically, this war was very important because it kind of changed the tide about what people thought about the Eastern powers at the time, considering in the early 1900s, Europe was on its very bougie, what's the right word? Holier than thou. Well, I guess Europe's always been like that, but this kind of changed the stage and the power balance between the world, and it also set up some major events, including World War I and even World War II. So at the time, Russia was already a very major power, very major player in the world in the earliest 1900s. And, so they had a lot of territory. Russia's a very large country, everybody. Not sure if you've looked at a map recently, but I believe Russia is I want to say largest, or maybe the second largest country in the world. And so, it started a long time ago, folks. So they had a lot of territories in Eastern Europe and Asia. But it never really extended into the Far East. It was more Central Asia at the time. And at the same time, Japan was the dominant force in Eastern Asia. So, this kind of, this conflict set up a lot of big changes, really, in what people thought about the East and the West. Typically, for the most part, European powers never really had major wars with the Eastern countries. They would do things like trade with them, or kind of like screw them over, for lack of better words, with Britain, and most of the world, but like India and France with Vietnam, or England and China with the opium. It's just a very, very spotty history between the two areas of the world. So a lot of scholars say that this Russo-Japanese War really set the stage for the last two world wars. A lot of the issues and reasons for this war were the same issues and reasons for the following world wars, and we're going to dig into that right about now. So this war started in 1904, and so Russia was led by Tsar Nicholas II, and it was one of the largest territorial powers in the entire world at the time. Tsar Nicholas was an autocrat, so yeah, not too different from most of Russia's. Well, actually, what am I talking about? This was prior to the Russian Revolution, so I believed. Nicholas II was the last technical autocrat in the Russian history there. I guess you could make a case for Vladimir Putin and Stalin. I suppose Stalin was more of a dictator, but this was before the revolution where Lenin took the power, and we could talk about that at a different time. But so there was a Siberian shipping center in Vladivostok. Yes. And it was forced to close for often many times in the winter months because it got so cold there and a lot of ice. So the Russian Empire was in search of a warmer water port in the Pacific Ocean for, a base for its trade as well as a port for naval activities as it was expanding its power and its navy especially. So Tsar Nicholas, he eyed up Korea and the peninsula and the Liaodong Peninsula, which would be in China nowadays. And he was like, hey guys, we're going to set our port up here and it's going to be great. We're going to have some warm Pacific waters, going to increase our trading and our military reach. So the Russians already had a port leased on the Liaodong Peninsula from China, and this port was called Port Arthur. But they wanted to have it as, a base of their operations in the Pacific, and they wanted it to be solely under their control, instead of having it leased to them, like an expensive car in a rap music video. So the Japanese, they were a little concerned about the Russian influence in Eastern Asia. There was actually a first Sino-Japanese War, which was between China and Japan. And, Russia had provided support for the... I'm honestly, I apologize. I'm very bad with the pronunciation on some of the Chinese. I think it's Qing, Qing, Empire in China. So it was between that empire and the Japanese at the time. And so the Russians gave their support to the Chinese, and yeah, they just had some bad history there. So the Russians obviously also had a lot of aggressive military history, and the Japanese actually wanted a deal offering to give them control of Manchuria, which is northeastern China. And under the terms of the proposal, Japan would have maintained their influence over Korea. However, the Russians refused the offer and demanded that Korea north of the 34th parallel would be a neutral zone. And once these negotiations kind of fell apart, the Japanese said, you know what, we're sick of these Russian autocrats and their highfalutin European power, and they decided they wanted to go to war. So on February 8th, 1904, the Japanese had a surprise attack on the Russian Navy at Port Arthur. And with that, the Russo-Japanese War officially begins. So Japan formally declared war against Russia on February 8th, 1904, so the same day as the attack. But the leaders of the Russian Empire, including Tsar Nicholas, did not receive the notice of Japan's intentions until hours after the attack. And this was kind of a big deal. Obviously, war is always a big deal, but this was Russia's navy. This was their base of operations in the Pacific. I hate to draw parallels to events that weren't super. Well, I guess they're kind of tied together, but think of it kind of like Pearl Harbor, but much earlier and against the Russians. So at this time, Tsar Nicholas had been informed by his advisors that the Japanese would not challenge Russia in a military, in a hoedown showdown war, and this was even after their negotiations fell apart. So, international law at the time didn't require a formal declaration of war prior to launching an attack. That would come later in 1907, and that would be 2 years after this war ended. So what the Japanese did was fair game. It may not have been, it was kind of a sucker punch, cheap blow, but here we are. So the Japanese Imperial Navy, they attacked the Russian Far East Fleet at Port Arthur, and it was designed to neutralize the Russian naval power in the region. Once again, very similar to Pearl Harbor in 1941. So the Japanese leader, I guess he wasn't the leader, but he was the admiral of this, the Japanese Imperial Navy. His name was Togo Haihachiro. Wow. The Japanese Imperial Navy, they sent out torpedo boats to attack the Russian vessels, and they did some pretty serious harm, very seriously damaging 3 of the largest Russian ships. The Tsarevich, the Redvizon, and the Pallada. Once again, I apologize. Japanese and Russian and Chinese are a little rough. So no offense if I'm just absolutely butchering these names. So the Battle of Port Arthur began the next day. And although most of the Russian Far East Fleet was protected within the harbor, the Japanese attacks did dissuade the Russians from taking the battle into the open oceans, even though the attempts to establish a blockade of the port had failed. So, long story short, the Japanese attacked Port Arthur on February 8th. On February 9th, there was a full battle there, and 3 of the largest Russian ships were damaged. And although the Japanese could not blockade the port entirely, this act of aggression by the Japanese made the Russians think maybe we shouldn't go out into the open water and be ambushed or whatever by the Imperial Navy out here, so they stayed put. That being said, the Russian ships that evaded the Japanese, they didn't get out of the fight they didn't get out without scars. On April 12th, 1904, the Petropavlovsk and Podeba battleships were able to leave the port, but they hit mines, and just after they made it out into the open sea. So the Petropavlovsk sank, and the Podeba actually was very heavily damaged and came back to port. So while the Russians avenged the attack by laying down a series of mines of their own, which very badly damaged 2 Japanese battleships, Japan retained the upper hand at Port Arthur and just bombarded the harbor by just launching heavy shells for a while. And the thing about shelling is that not only does it's effective if you hit the targets and, damage the ships or the port or the base or whatever, but shelling is very it's damaging on the psyche of a soldier. So if you think of shell shock in World War I, it's because of the constant bombardment. You never know when a shell's going to come down. You never know if it's going to hit you. You never know if it's not. All you know is that they keep coming. And that is what the Japanese attempted to do there, and they did so successfully. So after that, the Japanese tried to attack the Russian forts located in Manchuria, and the Liaodong Peninsula. So this was a big mistake, as the Russians fought them back and resulted in a lot of casualties for the Japanese. It was an onslaught. That being said, Japan's they just kept coming, and being persistent actually paid off for them, which is a lesson for what the Russians would end up doing in World War I, but more so World War II, where they would just have a onslaught of seemingly ending waves and waves of people, despite not having equipment. Like, some people would have guns, some would hold ammo, and you pick up the dead guy's gun, and there you go. Wowee, you got gun and ammo. So maybe they pulled a play out of the Japanese playbook right there. So in late August of 1912, the forces from northern Russia came down to assist the fleet at Port Arthur, and they got pushed back by the Japanese at the Battle of Liaoyang. And the Japanese new positions that they gained on the land was in the vicinity of the harbor, Port Arthur. So, Japanese guns would fire relentlessly on the Russian ships that were stuck in the bay. So once again, the heavy shelling comes into play here. It's very effective in these types of situations, especially when you have a sitting duck type of enemy right there. So by the end of 1904, the Japanese Navy had sunk every single ship in Russia's Pacific Fleet and gained control of a Russian garrison on a hill that overlooked the harbors. So the Japanese at this point basically had complete control of Port Arthur, the harbor, and some of the surrounding territories. This was a big deal because a lot of people, didn't really give the Japanese a chance in this fight. I wouldn't say Russian, but the European superiority complex was a very big thing in the early 20th century, and they were kind of having this idea shattered a little bit. So in early January of 1905, Russian Major General Anatoly Stessel, who was the commander of the garrison at Port Arthur, surrendered, and this was a huge surprise to not only the Japanese but to also the leaders in Moscow. He said that he believed that the harbor wasn't worth defending. As like he thought that the lives that would be lost defending the harbor outweighed the actual strategic port. And this is the kudos to him, because we know, looking forward into the past, Back to the Future, right? We know that that's something that the Russian, I guess the Soviet Union didn't really prioritize much. So after that, the Japanese had a huge victory in the war. They got the major general to surrender. And what happened to him was Stessel was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. Although he was later pardoned for his actions, so that's good to see. As a result, though, the Russian Navy had sustained massive losses during the Battle of the Yellow Sea. And, this forced the Russian Empire's leaders to mobilize the Baltic Fleet to the region as reinforcements. So, this war also spread a little bit further into Manchuria and Korea. So, this string of defeats and surrenders had the Russians distracted, and their morale was low. So at the time, the Japanese ground forces were basically controlling the Korean peninsula after landing at Incheon, and it's modern-day South Korea. So within 2 months, the Japanese had taken over Seoul and the rest of the Korean peninsula. So basically, so far, the tale of the tape is the Rocky versus Apollo, but in the second fight, I believe. Well, I guess a better comparison would be Rocky IV, which is, in my opinion, the best Rocky movie. There's a fantastic training montage in the Russian forest. So you should check it out. But basically, it was a story of a disrespected smaller opponent really handing it to the people's champ. So by the end of April 1904, the Japanese ground forces began to plan an attack on Manchuria, which was controlled by Russia at the time. So during the first large-scale major land battle of the war, the Battle of the Yalu River, the Japanese had a successful attack against the Russian Eastern Detachment in May 1904, and it forced them to retreat back to Port Arthur. So, with the fighting at a bit of a, not stalemate, but they kind of just said, hey, it's pretty cold out here. In the Manchurian winter, they stopped for a couple of months, and the next big battle on land was February 20th, 1905, when the Japanese forces again attacked the Russians at Mukden. And this led to days and days of very intense fighting. So they were able to push back the Russians at their strategic flanks, and the Japanese eventually forced the Russians into a full retreat. So on March 10th, 1905, after 3 weeks of fighting, the Russians, they suffered significant casualties, and they got pushed back into northern Mukden. So the Japanese are just rolling right now, and Russia's just eating these punches. They're not really sure what to do, but they're just getting bodied by the Japanese right now, everywhere that they turn. So, although my chair almost fell off on me. So, although the Japanese, had achieved a very important victory during the Battle of Mukden, they also themselves had very serious casualties. And, at the end of the day, their navy would be the one that would win the war for them. So, the Russian Baltic Fleet actually arrived as reinforcements in May 1905. And they sailed basically 20,000 nautical miles. Which is a very, very large, that's a big deal, especially back in the early 20th century. But now they face the challenge of navigating the Sea of Japan and, getting to Vladivostok without Port Arthur being open to them. So they sailed at night to avoid getting caught. And the Russian reinforcements, what do you know, they get seen and surprised by the Japanese. And this was after hospital ships opted to burn their lights in the darkness. So they saw the Russian reinforcements coming. And once again, Japanese admiral of the Imperial Navy, Togo Hitachiro, he led the navy and attempted to block the reinforcements' path to Vladivostok. And it began the Battle of Tsushima Straits. So the Battle of Tsushima Straits occurred late on May 27th, 1905. So by the end of the battle, the next day, the Russians had lost 8 battleships and more than 5,000 sailors and men. Only 3 Russian ships ultimately made it to Vladivostok. And after this, the Russians decided, man, we've had enough of this. We are getting destroyed right now. And this loss led to the decision by the Russians. It kind of forced their hand to pursue peace with the Japanese. So, at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, it was pretty big deal. It's believed that both sides had casualties of more than 150,000 combined, as well as about 20,000 Chinese civilians that were killed in the fray. So most of the civilian deaths were attributed to the barbaric tactics of the Russians when they were in Manchuria. A lot of journalists who covered the war said that the Russians would loot and burn several villages and raped and killed most of the women living there. And there's nothing to joke about, obviously. I'm saying this in total serious. The Chinese really they had to deal with this a lot in the early 1900s. This time it was at the hand of the Russians, and then come the late 20s and early 30s, the Japanese would do basically the same thing. So the fighting concluded. The Treaty of Portsmouth, and U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt he mediated this in New Hampshire, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So this was 1905. The war lasted only 1 year, which is kind of amazing considering how much the Japanese did and how much damage actually occurred. So for the Russians, negotiating was Sergei Witte, and he was a minister of Tsar Nicholas's government, and the Harvard graduate Baron Komura represented the Japanese delegation. Because of his role in the mediation here, Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So the aftermath of this war, although Japan won very decisively, it came at a cost. Japan didn't really have much negotiation power, as you may have expected. And under the terms of the treaty, which everybody signed on September 5th, 1905, Russia turned Port Arthur over to the Japanese forces, and they got to retain the northern half of the Sakhalin Island, which is in the Pacific coast, and it was a nice little territory there. So Roosevelt actually sided with Tsar Nicholas in the Tsar's refusal to pay indemnities to the Japanese. And the Japanese then kind of accused the Americans of, cheating them, screwing them over. And this really started the onset of anti-American feelings in Japan, and rioting that would ensue in Tokyo afterwards. So the Japanese people and government would question America's role in Asian affairs during the lead up to World War II. And Russia had also agreed to leave Manchuria and recognize Japanese control over the Korean Peninsula. So the Empire of Japan annexed Korea 5 years after, and this would have major repercussions during and after World War II. So, the very humiliating and costly defeats handed to the Russians by the Japanese, left Russia very demoralized and made a lot of other people very mad with Tsar Nicholas II. And basically, it galvanized the people of the political dissent, and this was a major stepping stone in the on the road to the Russian Revolution that would occur in 1917. And although the region had some peace at the time, it was far from over. This war shifted the balance of global power. And this was the first time that a modern Asian nation had defeated a modern European one in military combat. Especially at such a shocking and, devastating way. So this also would mark the beginning of, warfare, including world powers that would be in the Pacific. No longer would it be kind of transfixed on the Atlantic and the European western sides of the world. So the arbitration by Teddy Roosevelt, a great president, my favorite, actually led to some bad things for the Americans down the road, and I think that it led to a lot of anti-American feelings by the Japanese at the time, and it gave them fuel to the fire of what would lead up to be World War II and attacking Pearl Harbor. Another major thing that we covered, obviously, was the Russian Revolution. This was massive, instrumental in causing that. So next time you hear about the Russo-Japanese War, or you think about the most important conflicts of the 20th century, think about this one, World War Zer0. Set the stage for massive upshifts in geopolitical powers and policies, and laid the groundwork for World War I and World War II. So that is it for tonight's episode, guys. Thank you so much for sticking with me on Sleeping with Steve. Be sure to tune in for our next episode, which will be talking about the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And I hope you guys have a great night. Thank you so much.